Last week's chat saw Jabu pretty determined of just where he was going to go in life and pretty determined about how he was going to do it too. Much to Nkanyiso's chagrin, it was not quite going to fit with what he had hoped for his son. This week, well, I feel as though I've got some ghosts sitting over my shoulder. Yes, you're right, it's the Indaba site, and this is what we're going to be looking at today. But first, a little background. Because Carol has just received a long and detailed letter from Prune, all about Lalon's 70th. She's been roaring with laughter. But now she's trying to get herself back because she has work to do. Suddenly, her thoughts are underpinned by another favourite call and answer conversation. This time, between two Hugolin's robins in the tree above her. She managed to see one of them, perched, facing the early morning sun with its beak open and little breast puffed. She watched and listened, reluctant to break the glorious salutation to the morning. Oh, she loved the way their tails seemed to conduct the whistles and sweeps of sound. It was going to be yet another distinctive high-felt day. Deep early morning shadows, and still that absolute stillness. There was never much wind, except in August. Then it was just a flurry of dust and a slamming door. She could hear a group of African women laughing and chattering away at the tops of their voices as they made their way down towards the village below. In true rural tradition, they were making sure everyone heard what they said, so they could never be accused of gossiping or of talking about anybody else. She really envied them their joyful companionship. She reminded herself that she too was on Swapback, and she was doing an essay on King Lobengula, which is actually proving very hard and very difficult to find out enough to be able to write well. She started to stroll back to the house reluctantly, trying to refocus, when Timber rode up on his bike. He was also on Swatvac, having won that scholarship to the school at Goromonzi 6 years ago. He was preparing to write his A-levels as well. Carol hadn't seen a lot of him, but often when he couldn't get all the way back to Chilocho for an exia, he came and stayed in their thatched cottage in the garden. "Carol," he called joyfully, "guess what? I had a letter from some lawyers called Dodds and Brown. They said they'd heard I'd done well at Goromonzi, and would I like to go and talk to them about my future? So the headmaster took me in last week, and we had an interview. It was so hot, but I still dressed in my uniform, and I wore my maroon prefect blazer with all the badges pinned on very straight. They asked if I would like to take it off, and I was very happy to do so." "What happened then?" Carol asked. "They wanted to know what I was going to do when I left school. I said, when I was a child, I used to go to Enkundleni, the tribal court cases, with my father. So I thought I might also become a district assistant or even perhaps one day a district commissioner. Then they wanted to know about my father too. I told them that now I was older, all I wanted to do was to go to college or university to study natural resource management. But my father couldn't afford that. So I was going to see if I could get some work with national parks. After that, if I worked for a bit, I told them I might be able to get a scholarship to the new Chibero Agricultural College, which I think is starting in about 18 months. They were very interested, but they didn't say any more except to wish me good luck. I thought that was the end." "Oh, how disappointing, Timber." "Ah, but that's not the end of the story." Timber couldn't wait for interruptions. "Just now I got a call to go to the headmaster's office. Mr. Brown was on the phone. 'Carol, they are going to pay for me to study law at the University of Witwatersrand.' I said I didn't want to be a lawyer anymore, but they said that law was a useful basic degree. I could specialize in law governing wildlife and national parks as well as natural resources. What do you think?" "I think that's absolutely fantastic, Timber. But Wits is going through troubled times at the moment. It would be awful if you were caught up in it, or worse, if you were detained in a South African jail. They're much more anti-black down there than we are, and the rumours are horrible. You might never come out. Many South Africans think we're pinko liberals in Rhodesia. It could be hard to find someone to get you out. I suppose at least you have a firm of lawyers behind you, but still, it is South Africa. What does your father think? He has the same reservations as you, so I'd better think about it a bit more. Why not talk to Dad, Timber? He knows a lot about these things. He'd give you good advice. I don't know what an alternative to Wits would be, though, except, maybe Fort Hare? But Timber didn't want to go to Fort Hare, and the new University College of Rhodesia and Nyasaland didn't have a law faculty yet, although he had been told that was coming. Carol and Timber had only a month or so left at school to write those final exams. Prune was getting married, and Jabu? Nobody had heard a word from him. In the meantime, she had her essay to write. Why did Lobengula seem to trust white men? Did he let the Matabele people down? Some younger Matabele thought he was a traitor and sold his people too cheaply. Was the Rudd concession a contract, as other people thought? Was it Rudd himself who broke the rules, or Jemison, or Rhodes? Her father Angus walked across the lawn to sit beside her. You've heard Timber's great news, I'm sure, seeing him standing on his pedals as he rode off. That's a side of that rather serious, grown-up Timber that I haven't seen before. He is absolutely over the moon, Dad. It's such good news. He deserves every bit of it. How I wish I had his powers of concentration. I'm really battling here. What was Rhodes like, Dad? Some describe him as a compassionate humanitarian. Others saw him as a dastardly empire builder who stomped uncaring across the land and its people and the subject of my essay, King Lobengula. Yeah, a bit of all of that, I think. You can only compare as many pieces of written research and articles as you can find about any particular action or time. As many as possible. Read them. Understand that every one of them will be written with a pretty undisguised bias as the writer, but each will contain some almost identical components. Those will be the truths. Find them, harvest them, use them. It's all just so dry as dust. I find it really, really boring and really, really hard to concentrate. Angus laughed and put his arm round his daughter's shoulder. Well, here's a thought. Let's try and bring it to life for you. I have to go down to Matabeleland next week to talk to Chief Kaisa Ndueni at Ntabazinduna. He was the one who insisted that the African Affairs Board be set up as part of the federal government structure. In itself, Ntabazinduna is one of the most historical places in Matabele history. I have plenty of leave to, so why don't we tag on a couple of days and find some of these places? Mum can come with us and it'll be a bit of a break for her. I'd like to give you my interpretation of what happened when, and if possible, why. How does that sound? Wow, that sounds fantastic. But will I have time to write it all up once we get back? He smiled at her fondly. Your mind will be so full of a million truths and speculations, he said, that it'll just fly off your pen. I don't suppose we could go and see Prune on the way. He's having a few problems from what he says in his last letter. After describing all the success of Lalonde's birthday, he finished it off by saying he's now thinking of going back to Cholocho for a while. I just feel something's not right. Sadly, Prune had an enemy in the camp, who managed to persuade the generous Mr. Bellini that some money had been stolen following Lalonde's party. Prune had been fired. So Carol wrote to him, suggesting he join them in Bulawayo next week. The only bright spot in Prune's life right at that moment was the thought of spending a few days with Carol and her father at Ntabas and Dona and in Bulawayo, and then it was an easy trip to Cholocho. Yes, he would certainly get a lift with Lalan to meet at Ntabas and Dona. Carol had just got her driver's license and was nervously managing the strips on the road back to Bulawayo. It wasn't a happy trip, because memories of school kept flooding back. But then they turned onto Borrow Street. There was the old swimming pool, full of reminders of the screaming excitement of galas and water bombing. Then there were the parks and the gardens, and the fountain. She'd forgotten the fountain. It was a beautiful city. Into Selborne Avenue, past the lawns and palms of the City Hall, and the clock she watched every time she had to go back to school, dreading the moment and willing it to stop. Dad was chattering on. There were pretenders to the throne all over the place, but Nkulumane was nowhere to be found. In the meantime, Jandu, who was a very good horseman, had ridden to Inyati Mission to be with one of the few people he did trust, a man called Thomas Morgan Thomas. I do feel sorry for him. He was even more reluctant to be king. But he wasn't missing. He tried hard for nearly 2 years, encouraging the Nkulumane factions to keep looking and reminding them that after all he was the son of a now despised Swazi woman. And so this mysterious Jandu you've been talking about became King Ravangura? He did indeed. She began to get the feeling she might actually enjoy this trip after all, especially as they drove in to find Prune and Lalan waiting for them. There was so much catching up to do, so they sat in the typical heat of a late Matabele land afternoon, drinking very long glasses of iced homemade lemonade. It was good to be home. 5 a.m. start tomorrow, Prune and Carol. Wow, this was getting serious. Somehow they made it, to find Angus had already loaded the car up for the day's exploration. Although they were heading for King Zilikazi's burial site, they suddenly drew off to the side of the road. Angus pointed out to the bush on the right, and Carol and Prune looked out eagerly to see if there were any animals. There it is, over there, the site of the great Indaba, between Rhodes and the chiefs. Can you see that tree with a fence around it, and an old ant-heap mound leading up to it? There's somebody sitting on the ant-heap, Prune whispered. Look, perhaps we'd better not disturb him. He does not look very happy. He's holding his head in his hands. Oh, all right, we'll park a bit further on, Angus agreed. They found a shaded spot just beyond the Indaba site and wound the windows down to let in some air. They looked back at the ant-heap and the tree, then at the koppies around the site. Angus spoke in hushed tones. This is a historic spot. The reason we are here is to give you a better picture of what took place from the time the Matabele claimed this part of the world up to the war in 1983 and then the rebellion of 1896. This is a pivotal part of that story. The man in the ant-heap stood up. He looked across at them briefly and then walked on to the bottom. He turned and stared at the ant-heap for a moment, then glanced up at the surrounding koppies and shook his head. He looked over the road again and started walking towards them. Timber! Carol shouted. It's timber! Prune looked. She was right. The two of them got out of the car and ran across the dusty road, with Angus following close behind. They couldn't believe they'd met up at this unlikely place. What on earth are you doing here, Timber? Angus asked. I'm doing my history project for A-levels, Mr. Davidson, and I remembered something my father told me many years ago. I wanted to check it. and thought I'd come down to the archives in Bulawayo, then walk out here to try and imagine it all. I hadn't realized how far it was to walk, and I was coming across to ask you for a lift back, not realizing it was you, of course. Well, you can certainly have that. And next time, just check before to see if we're heading south. We could have brought you all the way from Goromonzi. Angus laughed. It's a little cooler in the car, so come and tell us what you've been up to. Timber sat in the front seat of the old Morris Oxford. Ice-cold Fantas and lemonades were passed around. Then he began his story. You remember how I used to go to Botswana to see my Babankulu? Well, when I wrote for my scholarship to Goromonzi School, my father told me I was not full-blood Ndebele, but part was from Bakwena people, closer to the Tswana. It was an amazing story. It turns out that my Babankulu's father, Mochodi, rescued a whole lot of young children. And so, 3 of the 4 one-time close friends and childhood playmates were together again for the first time for many, many years. What a pity nobody knew where Jabu was. But you never know. We just might find out in next week's episode. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope I got the accents right. It was a little bit hit or miss, but never mind. Hopefully it played a part in the story. See you next week.